First, to the 16th anniversary of 9/11. Later tonight, Americans from all walks of life will assemble at the site of the World Trade Center in New York to pay homage to the nearly 3,000 dead victims of the 9/11 hijackings. It was America's worst terrorist strike. But 16 years on, questions remain whether the 9/11 Commission did a credible investigation and were the results of this investigation reflected in its report. It's instructive, therefore, to relook at some of the reports and analysis dating back to 2004 when the 9/11 report came out. Pakistan's respected Friday Times Weekly says in a report that Pakistani diplomats told the Public Accounts Committee during secret briefings in March 2006 in Islamabad, and I'm quoting, "Some of the 9/11 Commission members were bribed to prevent them from including damaging information about Pakistan. The disclosure sheds doubt about the integrity and honesty of the members of the 9/11 Inquiry Commission and, above all, the authenticity of the information in their final report." Now, who were the members of the 9/11 Commission who may have been influenced to look the other way? We begin with the role of Thomas Keane, a 9/11 panel chairman. He has a glaring conflict of interest. His former business partner was a Saudi national, Khalid bin Mahfouz, who was brother-in-law of Osama bin Laden. Another was Hussein al-Almudi, who transferred millions of dollars into bank accounts in London and New York linked to Al-Qaeda. Take a look at the other members of this panel. Philip Zelikow, executive director of the 9/11 panel, is alleged to have intimidated and discouraged his staff from incorporating any findings that could be damaging to President Bush. Jamie Gorelick, reportedly close to the CIA chief George Tenet at that point, may have covered up the agency's many dubious links to terror groups. Andrew Rice, head of a committee representing the families of the 9/11 victims, went on record saying, and I'm quoting again, "The official 9/11 Commission was fixed in from the very beginning. The result was a complete blurring of Pakistan's role." Bruce Rydell, senior director for South Asia of the National Security Council, had publicly said, and I quote again, "If there was a state sponsor of Al-Qaeda, it was the Pakistani army acting through its inter-services intelligence, or the ISI." The Pakistan Foreign Office is alleged to have paid American lobbyists hundreds of thousands of dollars to get anti-Pakistan references dropped from the 9/11 Inquiry Commission report. This commission received an explosive report from anonymous and well-placed sources in Pakistan that, I quote, "The imprints of every major act of international Islamist terrorism invariably passes through Pakistan right from September 11, where virtually all the participants had trained, resided or met in, coordinated with, or received from or through Pakistan. But the 9/11 report makes no reference to the ISI, Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, although the FBI had confirmed the connection between the ISI, Omar Sheikh, and the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta." Take a look at the role of Omar Sheikh. ISI chief General Mahmoud Ahmad had instructed Omar Sheikh to wire $100,000 to the 9/11 lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta. Omar Sheikh has never been tried on that charge, but he was found guilty by a Pakistani court of killing journalist Daniel Pearl and remains on death row. There is no evidence that he killed Pearl. In fact, Pearl's wife and the US government have both stated that he was not the man behind the killing, but he remains in jail. General Ahmad was removed from his job, but the money trail was never properly followed up. In fact, the commission in its report makes the strange point, and I'm quoting, "Who funded the operation is of little practical significance." So this is where things stand 16 years on. Joining us, Glenn Carl, former intelligence officer with us from Massachusetts, Mayad Ali, senior defense analyst with us from Islamabad. Good evening to both of you. Glenn, what do these statements in fact say about the kind of investigation America has conducted into 9/11?
Well, I'm actually troubled by the list of innuendo and allegations. This really disturbs me because I've worked with my colleagues who work with and on Pakistan and on Afghanistan and on Al-Qaeda and members of the 9/11 Commission for years and years. It's inconceivable, really, that this kind of information, specific elements of it and all of it together, would not have leaked in other ways or been transmitted in other ways in-house for the years after 9/11, on which I was working on Al-Qaeda and terrorism, and then to Congress, and then to the media, and then to the public. So I actually find that this takes, each specific point takes a bit of accurate quotation or a reference, and then builds a story that is not the truth as we understand it. Certainly Pakistan, the ISI, is implicated with terrorist groups. There's no question of that. The statement, but that doesn't mean that they were behind 9/11. There's no evidence. In fact, the evidence indicates really that they were not the masterminds of this. Al-Qaeda was. Now, was Al-Qaeda facilitated in some way by ISI's collusion across the border and in Waziristan with Al-Qaeda and with the Taliban, or at that time different groups? That you can say, but from there you can't say that Pakistan is behind 9/11. So altogether, the 9/11 report has flaws, but that members of it would have been bought off, some of whom I have worked with. No, this I'm sorry. There's a lot of criticism and blame to go towards Pakistan, but I don't blame them directly for 9/11. I do blame them for supporting terrorist groups.
I'm not blaming Pakistan. I'm saying that there were members of the investigative team, there were top US senators, and there were lobbyists who successfully managed to get any references to Pakistan or ISI deleted from the commission report. To that extent, do you agree that there were discrepancies and there was fault both on the American side and the Pakistani?
I'll believe, I certainly will accept that Pakistan has probably spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, as many lobbyists do, trying to influence American opinion and so on. That I will accept. That they bought off, paid off various members of the commission, I find hard to go there.
Okay. We have Stephen Golub as well. Stephen, your thoughts on these reports, which basically say that there was a very strong Pakistan connection, that then Director General of the ISI helped wire $100,000 US, which eventually made its way to the lead hijacker in the 9/11 attacks. And yet enough was not done to highlight Pakistan's role, and top US senators were complicit.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to tell you something you may not want to hear in terms of my agreeing with Glenn on this. For one thing, I would simply defer to him to a good extent as, someone whose intelligence knowledge is quite expert. But even if you weren't having Glenn on the show at all today, I would be basically saying the same thing, that yes, Pakistan has been involved with many terrorist activities or supporting them. I think there may be no doubt that there are some connections between person A and person B, or institution A and institution B, in this whole sordid story. But leading to the conclusion that Pakistan was behind or funded the 9/11 attacks, I have to differ with. I mean, just to take a slightly different tack, I'm not sure why it would have been in Pakistan's interest to fund these attacks. It did cause the government then all sorts of problems to try to then cooperate with the U.S. in ways that contradicted some of its policies and some of its interests. So I'm not even sure what the interest would have been in Pakistan in backing these horrible attacks. But beyond that, I think if you go back far enough, you can connect many people in many ways, but it doesn't really end up adding up to a cohesive narrative that's convincing. I guess I would add that even though there are questions about the 9/11 report, the U.S. 9/11 report, in the U.S. they've been mostly about, well, was the Saudi connection, the Saudi Arabian connection, adequately discussed? And even though I'm not saying everyone on that commission was a paragon of principle, I think it is a stretch to accuse them of of having taken bribes or being unduly influenced to cover up or allow the cover-up of Pakistani involvement with this.
Mayad Ali, the Friday Times many years back put out a report which said lobbyists helped Pakistan win sympathy of 75 US congressmen as part of its strategy to guard Islamabad's interests in Washington.
Well, as far as that report is concerned, I think it might have been done. But as far as the fact that you're narrating that Pakistan was involved or behind somehow the 9/11 episode, I think it's going too far. Well, I would try to explain what happened. You see, Pakistan, the U.S., we were together since 1979, fighting Afghan war against the former Soviet Union, of course, and Pakistani ISI was involved and was used in every which way they could have. So they were together in this fight. And when that fight was won by the U.S. and when the U.S. left Pakistan high and dry, those connections between the people, the people who had worked with Taliban at that time, or Mujahideen, they were called, such as at the time, those connections remained long after that victory. And those connections, you see, the relationship between these people from sensitive agencies and from within the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or whatever you name them, remained as no matter those people retired. Of course, many of them who were serving with the Pakistan Army or ISI at that time during the 1979 war had retired by the time this 2011 thing, 2001 thing happened. So there's a gap of 20 years. So there were many people who were still in contact with, having inclination towards that sect, that Wahhabi sect. And they were with them. They were sort of sharing information. They might have been, but other than that, officially, any serving ISI, I would say, officer could have colluded somehow with Al-Qaeda at that point in time. I think it's a very far-fetched idea.
Okay. So you're all of you are on the same side, but Glenn, I have to ask you this. You were in service then, if I'm not wrong, and how clear then was Pakistan's role in facilitating the attackers, if not funding? What kind of pressure was there to bury any reference to Pakistan or the ISI?
Oh, no, well, none of which I'm aware, and I believe that I would have been aware of pretty much everything. Of course, I'm not privy to private confidential conversations between the director of the CIA and the director of ISI or something of that nature. I don't know what my children say one-on-one with their friends and associates and so on even. But I certainly know what the numerous relevant bodies, offices, centers, and officers in the CIA, in the American intelligence community, in the American military, in the administration, then the Bush administration when I was working in relevant after 9/11, thought, believed, thought they knew, did know, or didn't know. And none of us have been particularly happy with Pakistan's involvement with, or ISI's especially, with the Taliban, with terrorist groups, and the sympathy of numbers of individuals of significance in Pakistan for a progressively anti-Western radical Islamic theology or philosophy. But connections to 9/11 and Al-Qaeda directly, no, really. People, I think a relevant point is, one, whether in India or England or in the United States, tends to think that, one, the United States acts coherently with a great strategy in mind, and two, that we are able to keep secrets and conspire and have these vast plots in our strategic plans. And none of that is true. All governments, the United States included, are on the overall will come out with a broad direction, but that in which it tries to move, but is being pulled in 5,000 directions simultaneously, with competing centers of power and knowledge, understanding, doubt, and confusion. And in that context, which is a human one, it is essentially impossible, certainly in the American context, to have such explosive information when we were so determined to destroy anybody or any entity involved in the attacks for that kind of thing to remain secret. I just don't see that as realistic, given the bureaucracies and the procedures that I lived.
Well, the question is, who is the we? Let me give you an example, and let me bring this to Stephen Golub's notice. Stephen, we've discussed on countless occasions how the meetings and dealings of the current U.S. president, are under a cloud because not enough is known, and there is possibly a lot of falsehood there. I'm quoting a Washington Post report which says that Lieutenant General Mahmood Ahmad, who was the then ISI chief, was in Washington on 11th September 2001, and he had breakfast with two gentlemen, U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Mark Grossman and Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Bob Graham. And both of these people visited Pakistan just a few weeks before this attack happened. On the day of the attack, they were with the ISI chief having breakfast, and these two gentlemen subsequently became the chairman of the 9/11 Joint Inquiry. That's just one example.
Ramirez.
Well, I think you started out by alluding to the scandals swirling around President Trump.
Yes.
I think in that case, they may be more specific. It may involve some sordid business dealings, a quid pro quo with the Russian government. There's a lot of smoke there, so that many of us are very suspicious about something went on, but there's no fire. It hasn't been quite proven yet.
There is no smoke without fire, they say. And let me come back to the point I was making. The point I was making was this, that the people who eventually ended up heading inquiry committees were the people who were hobnobbing with the facilitators of this attack.
But, well, what I'd say is that it might be logical that they would have ended up heading the committee or playing crucial roles because they were experts or had key roles in the government. The fact that there happened to be a meeting that went on the day of 9/11, I think is much more likely a product of coincidence than some vast conspiracy involved, because that does seem to what this report is adding up to, that many people across the political spectrum, for various reasons, be it financial or otherwise, colluded to try to cover up some Pakistani ISI involvement with the attack, when I think the simpler and more logical explanation is that, yes, there were some coincidences involved. There might have been even funding that went back and forth from the ISI at some point to terrorist groups, but we know that they've been involved with certain radical extremist groups anyway. So, but to put all that together and to try to conclude that these many high-level officials who may oppose each other on other matters, who may not even be friendly or political friends, that they came together in this way, I think would be stretching matters. Look, supposedly there was supposed to be a meeting or an announcement regarding U.S. terrorist policy on 9/11 that got canceled because the attack took place that day. Now, I guess we could put that into this conspiracy theory, but it's more likely that these things just happen to come together, and if there's some people involved with certain meetings before 9/11 or on the day of 9/11 that then became involved with the investigation, it could have been because simply they were the logical people to be involved with the investigation. It's my point being, is anything conceivable? Yes. Is it the simpler explanation is that people were involved with the investigation because they were logical people to get involved with it, rather than that they were receiving bribes and were influenced or colluded in many, many different ways to cover this matter up. I get back to the point of interest. Why would it have been in their interest as well, even putting aside, I think, the real factual doubts, to collude in this way? Or why would it have been in Pakistan's interest to try to undertake or support this attack?
I live in India. I've grown up listening to this question and asking it, what is Pakistan getting out of it? But having said that, I come back to the original question of funding. So why have successive American governments not thought it fit to go to the source of the funding? Where did the money come from? Mayad Ali, I want to come to the case of Omar Sheikh, who's being held in the Daniel Pearl murder case. Interestingly, both Daniel Pearl's wife and the US government have said he probably did not do it. What he's also accused of is having wired $100,000 to Muhammad Atta. And the fact that he remains in jail in a case where most people believe he's not guilty is perhaps proof that the Pakistani government wants to bury the truth.
Look, if Pakistani government, if Sheikh that you're talking about was a key player in the whole thing, and he had done something on the ISI part, something for the ISI, then Pakistani authorities wouldn't have handed him over that easily to the U.S. authorities in Pakistan, who were just hunting down people everywhere in the country, and we were having a lot of problems because a lot of families suffered. Many missing persons are still there who are unaccounted for. You see, my point is, I agree to the point that Stephen has made, that yes, they were the right people to talk to. You see, Clinton had already warned Nawaz Sharif at that time, the Prime Minister of Pakistan at that time, that there was something very nasty going on in Afghanistan, and who could have they talked to about that? And ISI, being an intelligence agency, was the best, I would say, source for gathering information on what was going on in Afghanistan at that time. So there's a logical way to understand the whole matter, rather than resorting to conspiracy theories, because developing a connection between ISI, you see, why should ISI? The point is, why should ISI should have a motive for that? You see, whenever there's a crime, there's a motive. Well, I don't find any motive. Why should ISI sort of support or fund or do something that nasty,
right.
Taking the U.S. on, knowing that how the U.S. would respond and how it, and they saw the response, and the world saw the response. So Pakistan had been an ally. You see, we had good and bad relations, love-hate relationship, but Pakistan couldn't have gone to that extent.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this discussion with what a senior EU diplomat said, and I'm quoting. The 9/11 Commission seemed to be interested in putting up a good show as a cover-up, and of course they were very worried about damage control. I'm going to thank you all. You don't agree. You've formed a club of sorts here, saying that you do not agree with what you call a conspiracy theory. Mayad Ali, Glenn Carl and Stephen Golub, thanks very much. And ahead of the show, we'll talk about why there's so much brouhaha about the Saudi role, but a studied silence on what Pakistan has been involved in when it comes to 9/11.